All right, hi everybody. This presentation is on systems of privilege and oppression. So in this module, I asked you to watch a video that to this day I think is one of the most impactful videos that I've ever viewed in my life. I first saw this when I was, I believe, a sophomore in high school. My English teacher actually had us view this video, and then we read a book along with it that kind of paralleled a lot of the same ideas. And I'm referring to, of course, Jane Elliott's exercise, the brown eyes, blue eyes exercise, as it's pretty famously become known over the past several decades since she began doing this exercise. And we're going to unpack the themes represented in that video in this presentation and take a closer look at the objectives behind this exercise that has been very controversial. And it's controversial because it has to do with very sensitive subject matter, and that is privilege and oppression. Privilege is a really tricky thing to talk about with any individual. And as we'll identify here very shortly, it's hard to talk about because it's something that if you have it, you're taught not to recognize it. And when it's brought to your attention that you do have privilege, we get very defensive about it because we feel like any advantages or any successes that we've had in our life are things that we as individuals have earned through our own merit, right? And so this, you might be thinking, really kind of connects back to that idea of the American dream, which we talked about in a previous presentation on the sociological imagination. And if you remember, we said that sociology is really critical of this idea of the American dream because it suggests that at the individual level, any individual has the opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that if any individual works hard enough, they can achieve anything. And that really contradicts the reality for the lived experiences of millions of people around the world today. Millions of people work very hard and are unable to achieve that upward social mobility or to achieve those dreams that they have. And it's not due to a lack of effort. It's not due to a lack of drive or willpower. It's due to a lack of privilege. And so one of my favorite quotes from that video that I assigned to you from Jane Elliott's exercise was her saying, "The only thing necessary for the perpetuation of evil is for good people to do nothing." Okay? I think that's such a powerful quote, right? And that's really the problem of privilege. Like I said before, people that have privilege are often taught not to think about their privilege. And if we apply a conflict theorist perspective to this, it makes sense, right? Conflict theory suggests that people that have access to privileges or access to scarce resources try and hold on to them because it affords them power in society. And people with power don't want to give up their power. Having privilege feels great. You know, it gives us lots of advantages, which we'll unpack in this presentation. So the main objective of this particular presentation is to define and apply the concepts of privilege and marginalization. Specifically, I want us to think about applying these to our own lived experiences. And this can be something that is really difficult to do. So just kind of a sensitive content warning. You know, some people have a really hard time reflecting personally on how they experience privilege and oppression in their own lives. A lot of times people who experience a lot of oppression or people that experience a lot of discrimination try and kind of shove it down or keep it in because constantly thinking about it or reflecting on it can be very mentally taxing and exhausting, and that is completely justifiable. But what I will encourage you to do is everyone in this class needs to carefully reflect on how you experience privilege. It is so important, especially in our current political climate today, right? With what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and even with COVID-19. These are social problems that are affecting marginalized communities. And the only way we are going to overcome these social problems or produce any positive social change is for people with privilege to recognize how they are contributing to these problems, how very simply by having white skin, I am contributing to a system of racism, whether or not I know it, whether or not I want to admit to it, whether or not I want to take the time to critically reflect on it. It's a really important thing for people with privilege to do, to reflect on how you possess privilege, how you take your privilege for granted, and then most importantly, what changes you can make in your own life to address these systems of privilege and oppression that disadvantage marginalized communities. So I've been throwing out a lot of terms. Let's provide some explanation to what these terms actually are. So marginalization is the process of making a group of people less important or disadvantaged in a society. So in virtually every social structure that we've talked about, there's going to be a marginalized group, a group that gets disadvantaged, a group that is treated as that is treated as inferior in comparison to a group that is treated as superior. Oppression refers to the systemic and structural abuse of power by one group at the expense of others and the use of force to maintain that dynamic. So slavery is a great example of what oppression is and was in the United States. It was the systemic structural abuse of people of color, specifically the African Americans, often through the use of force, just so white people could have an advantage in society, right? And some people think, oh, well, slavery was abolished so many years ago. It's no longer a system of oppression. Racism no longer exists in our society. But the unfortunate reality is that racism is still very much a systemic form of oppression in our society today. And in just a week or two, we're going to be taking a much closer look at racism and the many social problems that stem off of systemic racism and systemic oppression in our society. So on the flip side of marginalization, there's also a system of privileging. So a privilege refers to any unearned benefit or advantage given to certain groups based on their social location within a society. So oftentimes we occupy identities that serve us privilege, give us unintended or unearned benefits in society, while we simultaneously may occupy some identities that cause us to experience marginalization. It's possible to be privileged and marginalized simultaneously. So everyone has a very unique social location in that regard, and we'll talk more about social location in just a bit. Being part of a marginalized group can negatively affect your ability to succeed in a society, while being part of a privileged group can increase your chances to succeed in a society. So this is what Dr. King was really getting at with that quote that we looked at in a previous presentation. You know, it's cruel to tell a person to pull themselves up by the bootstraps if they don't have any boots to begin with, or if someone's standing on their foot, right? Being privileged gives you opportunities to succeed at greater rates in comparison to groups that are marginalized. You know, if I came from a household where neither of my parents had a college education, I'm experiencing a disadvantage at my ability to go to college because my parents probably don't know how the admission process works. They probably don't have the ability to help me with my homework on my advanced classes that I would need to take so I can be college ready or to perform well on the ACT or the SAT. You know, there's disadvantages that we face as marginalized groups in society that other groups don't experience, and that affects our life consequences. So a few questions that might be helpful for you to pause this video and really reflect on, specifically in relation to some of the assigned readings and videos in this particular module. I'd love to hear or let you think about what your reaction was to watching the privilege walk video, right? That exercise where everyone started off standing in a straight line, right? This idea that everyone starts off from an equal foothold. And then someone was reading off questions, if you are a person of color, take a step back. If you have one college educated parent, take one step forward. If you have two college educated parents, take two steps forward. If your parents had jobs where they could have nights and weekends off, take a step forward. If you've ever feared being sexually assaulted because of your gender or sexual identity, take a step backwards. Think of all of these different aspects of our identity that affect how we experience privilege and oppression in so many different ways, right? And the important thing to do about that privilege walk is just that it's a great visualization about this reality that none of us come from equal places in society. No two people have the same background. No two people have experienced the same social structures or the same unique position in society. So it's really important for us from a sociological perspective to understand the intersectionality, as we call it, of social problems, right? The problems that a white woman face are probably very different than the problems that a woman of color faces, right? So we need to understand how our identities are intersectional and how we all simultaneously experience privilege and marginalization likely in different ways in our lives. I also hope you really took time to carefully read the How Privileged Are You list that listed, I think, 100 different ways that you may experience privilege that you never even thought of, right? Who would think that something like being able to walk into HEB and easily find a Band-Aid that matches your flesh tone is a form of privilege, right? Think about that, right? If you're a person of color, you probably have to get like this pale peach flesh Band-Aid that's going to stand out like a sore thumb if you have dark skin tone. But for white people, it's very easy to find white or clear Band-Aids that blend in with their skin tone, don't stand out at all, right? Something as small as that is an example of how you might experience privilege in society. And of course, privilege and marginalization goes into much deeper issues, like the reality that if you are a person of color, you're more likely to be pulled over by the police than if you're white, that if you are a woman, you are less likely to be hired in STEM sciences than if you're a man. There's all of these different facets of marginalization and oppression in our society. These are just a few examples of privileged versus marginalized groups in almost any social structure, whether we're talking about gender, race, socioeconomic status, sexuality, etc. There's almost always going to be one group that experiences privilege and one group that experiences marginalization. Typically, the privileged groups represent people who socially construct and benefit from those social structures, like we talked about. The social structure of gender in our society was largely socially constructed by men. Similarly, the social construction of race, so how we treat people based off the color of their skin, again, largely socially constructed by white people in the United States. And those have lasting consequences because, again, social structures are durable, they're built to withstand challenges, and change takes a very slow and incremental pace. So a social location refers to an individual's group memberships based off of your location in history and society. So oftentimes an individual's social location includes membership in both marginalized and privileged groups. It's not typical to say someone is just always privileged or always marginalized. Almost always you're going to belong to some collaboration or some collection of both marginalized and privileged groups. Our social locations can also be thought of as unique series of social structures that influence our lives. So if you go back to this list, if I asked you to circle where you fall on all of these marginalized groups, are you a man or are you a woman? Are you white or a person of color? Are you wealthy or are you poor? Odds are you probably circled some of these in each of these columns, which just goes to show that every individual has a unique social location. Every individual experiences marginalization and privilege in different and distinct ways depending on those intersections of their identity. So think about your social location. Do you belong to any privileged groups? Do you belong to any marginalized groups? Can you ever think of any instances in your life where being part of a privileged group opened doors for you? On the flip side, can you ever think of any instances in your life where being part of a marginalized group limited your opportunities? So if you want, you can pause a video and think about these. Maybe these are some ideas that you could incorporate into your weekly discussion post this week. That would definitely be a great idea as well. So another piece I asked you to read this week was titled White Privilege. This is a very famous, well-known piece written by Peggy McIntosh. And in her essay, McIntosh states that as a white person, I realized I had been taught about racism as something that puts others at a disadvantage, but had been taught not to see one of its corollary aspects, white privilege, which puts me at an advantage. So this is what I was getting at the beginning of this presentation. Oftentimes when we have privilege in a certain area of our life, we're taught not to think about that privilege, right? We think of racism as a system that oppresses people of color, but we don't think of racism as a system that privileges white people. And it's really important to understand it from both of those dynamics. So in that vein, why do you think people with privilege may be willing to acknowledge that inequalities exist, but be reluctant to admit that they receive any advantages for their privilege? Well, according to the sociological perspective of conflict theory, people with power are in control of the social structures of society, and they strive to maintain these social structures and subsequently their privilege and power, often at the expense of marginalized groups. So we'll end this video up here and pick up just one more brief video summarizing a few final thoughts and ideas pertaining to privilege and oppression.